Dalai Lama's commentary on the Bodhisattvas way of life, which he titles Healing Anger. These are some notes. First, three concepts. Afflictive states of mind are distorted. Love is not distorted. Neither are other positive states. Second concept is positive states like love can be strengthened. Third is that the essential nature of the mind is pure. And I have some other notes from the intro here. First is suffering and pain is part of life. Denying this can cause additional pain and suffering. Pain and suffering can be a catalyst for spiritual growth and helps to generate empathies for others' pain and suffering, and helps to instill a longing for spiritual freedom. Second concept here is the nature of reality is of the multitude of forces and independence on them on one another, so that things that cause other people's actions are related to various different causes and effects and so on. Third is dealing with individuals and being religious. You want to help others. Anger at them is inconsistent with that religious belief. Enemies are rare and provide unique opportunity for spiritual growth. If anger is predetermined, then being angry at anger is like being angry at fire for burning. If it is accidental, it's like being angry at the sky for being overcast. Okay, so here's some of my other highlights from the book. Patience, according to the Buddhist understanding of the principle, is a resolute response against adversity, stemming from a settled temperament unperturbed by either external or internal disturbance. Certainly this cannot be described as passive submission, rather as an active approach toward adversity. Shantideva's discussion of patience takes place within the framework of what could be called the three characteristics of patience. They are 1. Tolerance based on conscious acceptance of pain and hardships. 2. Tolerance resulting from reflecting on the nature of reality. And 3. Tolerance toward injury from others. Shantideva discusses the first aspect of patience in verses 12 to 21. He begins by observing that pain and suffering are natural facts of existence, and denying this truth can only cause additional misery. He then goes on to argue that if we could internalize this fundamental truth of our existence, we would derive enormous benefit in our day-to-day life. For one thing, we would see suffering as a catalyst for spiritual growth. Shantideva implies that a person who is capable of responding to suffering in this way can voluntarily accept the pain and hardship involved in seeking to achieve higher purpose. In theory, we are all aware of this principle. To protect ourselves against tropical diseases, we often submit willingly to the pain of inoculations. In arguing that it's possible to train ourselves to accept greater pain than we are capable of now, Shantideva writes the following memorable lines. There is nothing whatsoever that is not made easier through acquaintance. So through becoming acquainted with small harms, I should learn patiently to accept greater harms. He concludes the discussion of the first characteristics of patience by drawing attention to the positive aspects of suffering. If anything at all can be described as positive about pain and suffering, Shantideva asserts that it is our experience of suffering that awakens us from our spiritual slumbers. It is also suffering that enables us to identify with others' pain, thus allowing us to generate genuine compassion for them. Furthermore, it is suffering that instills within us the fear of evil, so crucial for the religious person. Finally, it is our insight into suffering that reinforces our longing for spiritual freedom. Of course, many of these sentiments can be said to be religious, which a modern reader may perhaps argue as being relevant only to a religious practitioner. But the basic insight of Shantideva stands, that is to say that if approached with appropriate attitude, even pain and suffering can be perceived in terms of their positive effects. Verses 22 through 34 discuss the second aspect of patience, tolerance based on understanding of the nature of reality. The main focus of Shantideva's argument here is demonstrating how actions of people and events are determined by a network of many factors. This is to underline the critical fact that many of the conditions which cause others to act in ways that are harmful to us are, in fact, outside their control. As Shantideva puts it, We become ill without wishing to be so. Similarly, we do not intend to be angry, but often find ourselves gripped with anger. So one could argue that in a sense it is illogical to isolate from the complex conditions only the person and hold him or her alone responsible for the act of harm. To illustrate this argument, Shantideva presents an unusual analysis of the simple act of someone hitting us with a stick. He shows how both the stick and the person who wields it are equally responsible for causing the pain. On a deeper level, he argues even the mere fact that we possess corporeal existence is an important contributory factor in generating the pain. A further condition, which in fact turns out to be the key cause, is the negative emotion which motivated the person to inflict the harm in the first place. It's obvious that the principle underlying the second aspect of patience is nothing but the fundamental Buddhist principle of dependent origination. In this view, nothing arises in isolation, for everything comes into being due to the aggregation of multiple causes and conditions. Since this principle can be understood at many levels in terms of causal independence, in terms of mutuality of concepts, or in terms of interdependence between our perceptions and the world, the insights into reality which give rise to greater tolerance towards events and others' actions can also vary in their depth. For example, Shantideva demonstrates how viewing the world as illusion-like can have immediate impact in reducing the intensity of our strong emotional reactions like anger. Shantideva writes the following to make this point. Everything is governed by other factors, which in turn are governed by others, and in this way nothing governs itself. Having understood this, I should not become angry with phenomena that are like apparitions. These lines echo similar observations Shantideva makes in the 9th chapter of his guide. There, after arguing for the Buddhist philosophical worldview based on an appreciation of the non-substantial nature of phenomena, he poses the following rhetorical question. What is there to obtain or lose? Who is there to praise or insult? Whence do joy and pain arise? What is there to be happy or sad about? On the surface, he may seem to be advocating apathetic equanimity, but to read this verses in this way is totally miss the point. Like all skillful teachers of Buddhism, Shantideva is drawing our attention to the intimate link between attachment and strong emotions like anger. The more we are attached to something, the more likely it is to make us angry when we perceive a threat to that object of attachment. Although Shantideva's discussion of tolerance based on insight into the nature of reality is situated within the Buddhist philosophical discourse, his basic argument does not depend upon the validity of Buddhist theories. From our own experience, we can see that the deeper our appreciation of the complexity of the circumstances giving rise to an event, the greater our ability to respond to that event with a degree of calmness and tolerance. We have now come to the final characteristics of patience, tolerance towards injuries from others. Perhaps it is because of its overwhelming importance that Shantideva treats this category last. One could say that of the 3 dimensions of patience, the third is probably the most important because it exclusively pertains to our immediate interaction with others. There is no denying that for most of us, the main object of our anger or frustration is also another human being. Until we learn to interact with others in a way that is not tainted by strong negative emotions such as anger, no genuine development of patience can take place. This is especially true for a practitioner of the Bodhisattva ideal, whose avowed aim is to help liberate all beings from a state of unenlightened existence. Of course, to such a person, being angry toward the very objects for whose salvation he or she has taken solemn religious pledge is most inappropriate. Shantideva teaches us that it is more appropriate to have compassion rather than anger towards those who cause harm to us. He suggests that those who cause harm to others are in some sense possessed. In other words, their actions stem from a state of ignorance. This is reminiscent of the Christian Gospel's injunction that we must forgive the perpetrators of evil, for they know not what they do. In fact, Shantideva asks us to go further and regard those who harm us, our enemies, as precious, for they alone give us a rare opportunity to practice tolerance. There are indeed many, he writes, there are indeed many beggars in this world, but scarce are those that inflict harm. For if I have not injured others, few beings will cause me harm. Therefore, just like treasure appearing in my house without any effort on my part to obtain it, I should be happy to have an enemy, for he assists me in my conduct of awakening. At times, Shantideva presents the arguments which appear to take rationalization to the extreme. There is an intriguing argument to illustrate the futility of anger as a response to others' harmful actions. He suggests that we examine whether inflicting harm on others is essential to human nature or if it is accidental quality. If it is the former, it is pointless to be angry, for this would be like begrudging fire because of its inherent capacity to burn. On the other hand, if it is accidental, it is still inappropriate, since this would be begrudging the sky for being overcast. Either way, there is no logical grounds for being angry. Regardless of its merits as an argument, no one can dispute its ingenuity. The question is, how serious should we take this kind of argument? Certainly there is no denying from a general reader's point of view that this form of argument can be best appreciated as thought experiments. We know that often we tend to reinforce our anger or outrage when we strongly feel that we are right. If this is true, then even a modern reader can accept the value of this kind of thought experiment, which poignantly reveals the illogical nature of having strong emotional reactions to an event. Shantideva, in fact, opens a chapter on patience with a statement that anger can destroy positive imprints created over 1,000 eons. And he further asserts that there is no evil like hatred, and that there is no fortitude like patience. Thus he recommends that we all seek to develop patience. In his view, anger is the principal obstacle to the development of patience. To use the well-known medical analogy, hatred is the poison and patience is the medicine that removes the poison toxins from the mind. As the Dalai Lama's commentary made clear, Shantideva identifies two key elements in our attempts to overcome anger. First and foremost, it is important for us to have a profound appreciation of the negativity of anger. Of particular relevance is to reflect upon the destructive effects of generating anger. Second, Shantideva identifies the need to develop a deep understanding of the causal mechanisms which underlies the arousal of anger. This is of special interest to the modern reader who will unavoidably be approaching the text with many of the popular assumptions associated with modern psychology. In verse 7, he makes a critical observation that the fuel of anger is what he calls mental discomfort. This is an interesting notion, which can be translated as dejection, unhappiness, or simply dissatisfaction. It's best understood as a pervasive underlying sense of dissatisfaction, which need not be felt at the conscious level. It is that nagging feeling that something is not quite right. Shantideva seems to be suggesting that it's this underlying sense of dissatisfaction that gives rise to frustration. When this happens, the conditions are set for an immediate outburst of anger. And once the causal nexus between dissatisfaction, frustration, and anger is understood, we can then appreciate the virtue of Shantideva's approach to dealing with anger. We can see that much of his approach is aimed at rooting out this underlying sense of dissatisfaction rather than engaging in a head-to-head confrontation. A few words on some of the general principles which lie behind the approaches suggested in the book. A key principle is belief in what would be called the plasticity of the mind, that is, an assumption in the mind's limitless capacity for improvement. Perhaps most important, it is vital to appreciate that the Dalai Lama does not believe in instant enlightenment. There's a basic assumption that cultivating inner discipline is a time-consuming process. In fact, Dalai Lama rightly points out that having expectations of immediate results is a sign of impatience, the very factor the teachings in this volume aim to counteract. Since patience or tolerance comes from a certain ability to remain firm and steadfast, to not be overwhelmed by the adverse situations or condition that one faces. One should not see tolerance or patience as a sign of weakness, but rather as a sign of strength coming from a deep ability to remain steadfast and firm. We can generally define patience or tolerance in these terms. We find that even in being able to tolerate a certain degree of physical hardship, like hot or cold climate, our attitude makes a big difference. If we have the realization that tolerating immediate hardship can have long-term beneficial consequences, we are more likely to be able to tolerate everyday hardships. Similarly, in the case of those on the Bodhisattva levels of the path, practicing high levels of tolerance and patience, intelligence also plays a very role as a complementary factor. Compassion can be roughly defined in terms of a state of mind that is non-violent and non-harming or non-aggressive. Because of this, there is a danger of confusing compassion with attachment and intimacy. So we find that there are two types of compassion. On one hand is compassion, which is based on attachment, which is tinged with attachment. That type of love or compassion and feeling of intimacy is quite partial and biased, and is very much on consideration that the object of one's affection or attachment is someone who is dear or close. On the other hand, genuine compassion is free from such attachment. There, the motivation is not so much that this person is my friend. Rather, is based on the rationale that just as I do, others have this innate desire to be happy and overcome suffering. Just as I do, they have the natural right to fulfill this fundamental aspiration. Based on that recognition of this fundamental equality and commonality, one develops a sense of affinity and closeness, and based on that, one will generate love and compassion. This is genuine compassion. In Buddhism, there are three principal distinctions of compassion. One is compassion which is not complemented by any wisdom factors. A second level of compassion is complemented by insight into the transient nature of sentient beings and their impermanent nature. Third level of compassion, called non-objectified compassion, the complementary factor is wisdom or insight into the ultimate nature of reality. At this level, one sees the empty nature of sentient beings, and this insight reinforces one's compassion towards sentient beings. Even though this type of compassion and infinite altruism is something that needs to be consciously cultivated and developed, we all possess the basis or potential for such enhancement and such development. One of the Dalai Lama's beliefs is that not only do we inherently possess this potential, but also the basic or fundamental human nature is gentleness. Not only human beings, but all sentient beings have gentleness as their fundamental nature. There are other grounds upon which Dalai Lama bases this belief. For example, if we look at the pattern of our existence from early age into our death, we see the way in which we are so fundamentally nurtured by affection, each other's affection, and how we feel when we are exposed to others' affection. In addition, when we ourselves have affectionate feelings, we see how it naturally affects us from within. Not only that, but also being affectionate and being more wholesome in our behavior and thought seems to be much more suited to the physical structure of our body in terms of its effects upon our health and physical well-being and so on. It also must be noted how the contrary seems to be destructive to health. For these reasons, the Dalai Lama thinks that we can infer that our fundamental human nature is of gentleness. Now, if this is the case, then it makes all the more sense to try to live a way of life which would be more in accordance with this basic gentle nature of our being. However, we do find a lot of conflict and tension, not only within our individual mind, but also within family. When we interact with other people and also at the societal level, the national level, global level, and so on, how do we account for that? One of the factors the Dalai Lama thinks that contributes to this conflict is our imaginative faculty, or in other words, intelligence. It is our intelligence which can find ways and means to overcome this conflict. So in using human intelligence to overcome this conflict, which is created by human intelligence, the important factor is human compassion. I think if we look at the reality, it's quite clear that the best way to overcome conflict is a spirit of reconciliation, even within oneself. that spirit has very much to do with compassion. One aspect of compassion is to respect others' rights and to respect others' views. That is the basis of reconciliation. I think that the rule of the human spirit of reconciliation, which is based on compassion, is working deep down, whether the person really knows it or not. Therefore, because our basic human nature is gentleness, no matter how much we go through violence and many bad things, ultimately the proper solution is to return to the basic human feeling, that is human affection. So human affection or compassion is not only a religious matter, but in our day-to-day life it is quite indispensable. Now, with this background, if one looks at the practice of tolerance, it is really quite worthwhile. No matter how difficult, it's worthwhile to do this practice. The first chapter of Shanti Deva's Patience chapter reads, "Whatever wholesome deeds, such as venerating Buddhas and practicing generosity that have been amassed over 1,000 eons, will all be destroyed in one moment of anger." The implication of this verse is that in order for the individual practitioner to be able to successfully cultivate patience and tolerance, what is required is a very strong enthusiasm, a strong desire, because the stronger one's enthusiasm, the greater the ability to withstand the hardships encountered in the process. Not only that, but one also will be prepared to voluntarily accept hardships that are necessary part of the path. The first stage then is to generate this strong enthusiasm, and for that what is required is to reflect upon the destructive nature of anger and hatred, as well as the positive effects of patience and tolerance. In this text, one reads that the generation of anger or hatred, even for a single instant, has the capacity to destroy virtues collected over 1,000 eons. Both this text and the entry into the middle way agree that it is only the meritorious virtues, not so much the wisdom aspect, but rather the method aspect of the past, which are destroyed. In particular, these include virtues accumulated through practicing giving or generosity, as well as virtues accumulated on the basis of observing an ethically disciplined way of life. On the other hand, virtues accumulated through the practice of wisdom, such as generating insight into the ultimate nature of reality, and virtues accumulated through meditative practices remain beyond the scope of destruction by anger and hatred. If one harbors hateful thoughts within, or strong or intense anger somewhere deep down, then it ruins one's health, so it destroys one of these important factors of happiness. Even if one has wonderful possessions, when one is in an intense moment of anger or hatred, one feels like throwing them, breaking them, or throwing them away. There is no guarantee that wealth alone can give one the joy or fulfillment that one seeks. Similarly, when one is in an intense state of anger or hatred, even a very close friend appears somehow frosty, cold, and distant, or quite annoying. If we examine how anger or hateful thoughts arise in us, we will find that, generally speaking, they arise when we feel hurt, when we feel that we have been unfairly treated by someone against our expectations. If in that instant we examine carefully the way anger arises, there is a sense that it comes as a protector. It comes as a friend that would help our battle or in taking revenge against the person who has inflicted harm on us. So the anger or hateful thought that arises appears to come as a shield or protector, but in reality that is an illusion. It's a delusionary state of mind. Chandraki states that there might be some justification for responding to force with force if revenge would help one in any way, or prevent or reduce the harm which has already been inflicted. But that is not the case, because if the harm or injury has been inflicted, it has already taken place. So taking revenge will not in any way reduce or prevent that harm or injury, because it has already happened. The moment that strong feelings of anger arise, no matter how hard one tries to adopt a dignified pose, one's face looks rather ugly. There is an unpleasant expression, and the vibration that person sends is very hostile. People can sense it, and it is almost as if one can feel steam coming out of the person's body. These are immediate consequences of hatred. It brings about a very ugly, unpleasant physical transformation of the individual. In addition, when such intense anger arises, it makes the best part of our brain, which is the ability to judge between right and wrong, and access long-term and short-term concepts, become totally inoperable. It can no longer function. It is almost as if the person had become crazy. These are negative aspects, the negative effects of generating anger. When we think about these negative and destructive effects, we realize it is necessary to distance ourselves from such emotional explosions. Second session. A master who has hatred is in danger of being killed, even by those who, for their wealth and happiness, depend on his kindness. By it, friends and relatives are disheartened. Though drawn by my generosity, they will not trust me. In brief, there is nobody who lives happily with anger. Hence, the enemy anger creates suffering such as these, but whoever assiduously overcomes it finds happiness now and ever after. These verses present the value and benefits of tolerance and patience. The more one is able to reflect on the destructive effects of anger and hatred, as well as the beneficial effects of tolerance and patience, the more one is able to develop a clear recognition of these, the more one will become cautious and distant towards angry or hateful thoughts. Consequently, one will develop an affinity for feelings of tolerance and patience that in itself will have a significant impact upon one's mind. One's enthusiasm for enhancing one's own capacity for tolerance and patience will increase, and likewise, one's actual practice of patience will increase as well. Once one has developed that high level of enthusiasm for practice, then one should engage in the actual practice itself. That is, enhancing tolerance and patience. The technique which is adopted here is to first seek and examine the causal factors and conditions that give rise to anger and hatred. This is very much in conformity with the general Buddhist approach for dealing with problems in difficult situations. in the Buddhist principle of causality is accepted as a natural law, and dealing with reality, one has to take that law into account. For instance, in the case of everyday experiences, if there are certain types of events which one does not desire, the best method of ensuring that those events do not take place is to make sure that the causal conditions which normally give rise to them do not occur. Similarly, if one desires a particular event or experience, then the logical thing to do is to seek and accumulate the causes and conditions that would give rise to it. This is also the case with mental states and experiences. If one desires a particular experience, one should seek the causes that would give rise to it, and if one does not desire a particular experience, like pain or suffering, then one should ensure that the causes and conditions which would give rise to it no longer arise. An appreciation of this causal principle is very important. Having developed the wish that one would like to reduce one's hatred and anger and overcome them, if one simply wishes or prays that anger and hatred no longer arise, or simply prays that they just disappear, he says this will not make it happen. In addition, if one tries to do something when hatred and anger has already arisen, it is unlikely to have much effect, since at that moment one's mind is gripped by the intensity of anger and hatred. At this instant, to try to apply something to prevent that arisal is a bit foolish. One is already almost out of control. So the best method is first to identify what factors normally give rise to anger and hatred. Having found its fuel of mental unhappiness in the prevention of what I wish for, in doing what I do not want, hatred increases and then destroys me. This verse states that the factor that fuels anger and hatred is, in this translation, mental unhappiness. But I think discontent may be a better word. A nagging sense of discontent, a feeling of being dissatisfied or of something not being right, is a fuel that gives rise to anger or hatred. What one should do is to try to see how to prevent the arising of that fuel, this feeling of discontent and dissatisfaction. Generally, this discontent arises in us when we feel that either we or ourselves or someone we love or our close friends are being treated unfairly or threatened. People are being unjust towards us or our close friends. At that instant, this feeling of discontent or unhappiness arises. Also, when others somehow obstruct us in achieving something, we feel that we are being trodden upon, and then we feel angry. So the approach here is to get at the root, appreciating the causal nexus, the chain, which would then ultimately explode in an emotional state like anger or hatred. The idea is to stop it at an early stage rather than wait for that anger or hatred to arise fully. For example, if one wants to stop the flow of a river, it is best to go to the source to do something about it, either divert it or do something else. Why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? And what is the use of being unhappy about something if it cannot be remedied? Here Shantidev gives another reason to avoid becoming unhappy, which is the situation or the nature of the problem is such that it can be remedied. Which is that if the situation or the nature of the problem is such that it can be remedied, then there is no need to be annoyed with it or to be unhappy about it. On the other hand, if the situation is such that the problem or the difficulty has no remedy and no possible resolution, then there's no point in being annoyed with it or unhappy about it. Well, we find that there are many factors and conditions that cause pain and suffering. The conditions that would give rise to joy and happiness are comparatively rare. Since this is the reality of our existence, it makes more sense to adopt an attitude that will engender a greater degree of tolerance. Suffering is part of reality, a natural fact of our existence. It's something that we have to undergo, whether we like it or not. We might as well adopt an attitude that enables us to tolerate it so that we are not so intensely affected by it mentally. If we do not have the level of tolerance, our life will be miserable. For example, one has a very bad night, that night seems eternal and never seems to end. Similarly, if one does not adopt an attitude that will enable one to tolerate suffering, then life will become miserable. For example, if someone is brought up in a very privileged environment with material abundance and without hardships, that person becomes spoiled often to the degree that his or her level of tolerance towards difficulties is very low. When even the slightest problem arises, that person cannot handle it. Without suffering, there is no renunciation. Therefore, mind, you should stand firm. These two lines tell us that not only is it important to reflect upon suffering, but there is a great benefit in doing so as well. Reflecting on suffering has tremendous significance because only through recognizing the nature of suffering is it possible to generate a genuine sense of renunciation, a genuine desire to seek freedom from this bondage. If some ascetics and people of Karnapa endure pain of cuts and burns for no reason, then for the sake of liberation, why have I no courage? If people are prepared to put up with hardships, pain, and difficulties in order to obtain goals which are not ultimate, then why should I, who aspire to attain full liberation from suffering, not be able to tolerate a degree of hardships and pain? We can find this instruction in many other Buddhist texts. It is not the way of the wise to give up something great for the purpose of a minor goal. Rather, it is the way of the wise to give up something minor for a higher purpose or goal. There is nothing whatsoever that is not made easier through acquaintance. So through becoming acquainted with small harms, I should learn to patiently accept greater harms. Who has not seen this to be so with trifling suffering such as the bites of snakes and insects, feelings of hunger and thirst, and such minor things as rashes? I should not be impatient with heat and cold, wind and rain, sickness, bondage and beatings, for if I am, the harm they cause me will increase. Some, when they see their own blood, become especially brave and steady, but some, when they see the blood of others, faint and fall unconscious. Hatred is the inner enemy that we have been discussing, and attachment or desire are the two cronies of ignorance. In other words, ignorance is like the prime minister. Attachment and hatred are like the two most powerful ministers. Together they constitute three poisons of mind. Buddha states that one should not indulge in actions which are unwholesome, but rather should always perform deeds which are wholesome. That way, life should be based on a disciplined state of mind. One should therefore tame or discipline one's mind. And that discipline, bringing about inner transformation, is indeed the essence of Buddha's doctrine or teaching. So, what this indicates is that ultimately whether one's action is unwholesome or wholesome or unwholesome depends on whether that action is arising from a disciplined state of mind or an undisciplined state of mind. We find other scriptures that indicating that if one's mind is disciplined or tamed or at peace, then it will lead to joy and happiness, whereas if one's mind is undisciplined and not at peace, then it will lead to unhappiness and suffering. Ultimately, it's one's state of mind which is the determining factor. One might feel that while it's true that one should engage in combat with hatred and anger and other delusions, what guarantee do we have what assurance do we have that we can gain victory over them? I think this is a very important point. One must have some assurance that one can, if one energetically pursues it, gain victory over the delusions. What premises or grounds do we have for accepting that these mental afflictions can be ultimately rooted out and eliminated from our mind? In Buddhist thought, we have three principal reasons for believing this can happen. One is that all deluded states of mind, all afflictive emotions and thoughts are essentially distorted in their mode of apprehension, whereas all the antidotal factors such as love, compassion, insight, and so on, not only are undistorted, but they also have grounding in our varied experience and in reality. Second, all these antidotal forces also have the quality of being strengthened through practice and training. Through constant familiarity, one can enhance their capacity and increase their potential limitlessly. So the second premise is that as one enhances the capacity of these antidotal forces and increases their strength, one is able to correspondingly reduce the influences and effects of delusionary states of mind. The third premise is that the essential nature of mind is pure. In other words, there's the idea that the essential nature of mind is clear light or Buddha nature. Some of these points are quite obvious, so that if one just pays enough attention, they will become quite clear. Some may remain quite obscure, hidden through analysis and investigation. One will be able to develop inferences, however. So all these can be understood through investigation and analysis. They do not require accepting the testimony of scriptural authority. Verse 21. Furthermore, suffering has good qualities. Through being disheartened with it, arrogance is dispelled. Compassion arises for those in cyclic existence. Evil is shunned and joy is found in virtue. In this verse, Shantideva elaborates on the benefits of thinking about suffering. First, he states that when one reflects upon suffering, when one appreciates the underlying unsatisfactory nature of our existence, then it will automatically reduce one's arrogance and feeling of conceit. Additionally, when one is aware of this suffering nature and of one's pain and suffering, it also helps to develop capacity for empathy, the capacity which allows one to connect with other people's feelings and suffering, thereby enhancing one's capacity for compassion towards others. In addition, by realizing the nature of suffering, one will develop a greater resolve to put an end to unwholesome deeds which lead to suffering, and one's enthusiasm for engaging in unwholesome deeds and actions which leads to happiness and joy will increase. However, it is important to be very skillful in one's application of the various techniques and not to be extreme in one's approach. For instance, if we have too much self-importance, if we are puffed up by arrogance based on our supposed or actual achievements or qualities, then the antidote is to think more about suffering and one's own problems and the unsatisfactory nature of existence. This will assist in bringing down the level of one's high position, opinion of oneself. It will bring one more down to earth, as it were. On the other hand, if one feels that by reflecting on the unsatisfactory nature of existence, suffering, pain, and so forth, one feels overwhelmed, then there's, again, danger of going to the other extreme, where one might become totally discouraged, helpless, and depressed. This can lead to thinking, I can't do anything, I'm not worth anything. That extreme is another danger. So under such circumstances, it is important to be able to uplift one's mind by reflecting on one's achievements, the progress one has made so far, one's other positive qualities, and so on, so that one can get out of that discouraged, demoralized state of mind. So what is required is a balanced and skillful approach. This is analogous to planting a sapling or seed. At its very early stage, one has to be very skillful and gentle. Too much moisture will destroy it. Too much sunlight will destroy it. What one needs is a balanced environment where the sapling can have healthy growth. Similarly, what one is seeking here is a healthy emotional and psychological growth. So here, again, one needs that gentle and skillful approach. Otherwise, there is a danger of going to extremes. In the 22nd verse, Shantideva presents a technique of developing patience or tolerance based on appreciation of the complex reality of a given situation. Here one can feel that since the aggressor has inflicted this pain and injury on me, I am totally justified in being intolerant. I am totally justified in being hateful or angry toward that person. Shantideva responds by stating that if we examine this carefully, we will find that among the factors that give rise to our pain and suffering, our feelings of hurt and harm, there are both animate and inanimate factors. Why is it that we particularly hold animate factors like people responsible and accountable, but not the inanimate factors such as the conditions that give rise to it? For instance, we don't hold grudges against our illnesses, although illness gives us pain.
One could argue that this is quite different because in the case of inanimate factors such as illnesses, they have no desire to injure us. It's not deliberate. Further, the illnesses and these factors arise without their own deliberation, without their own choice. Shantideva responds to this by saying that if that is the case, then even when a person inflicts harm on us, the harm that is inflicted is in some sense out of the person's control because he or she is compelled by other forces such as negative emotions, delusions, ill feelings, and so on. If we go even further, we find that even a very negative feeling such as ill will or hatred also comes about as a result of many factors and is the aggregation of many conditions which do not arise out of choice or deliberately. Verse 25, all mistakes that are and all the various kinds of evil arise through the force of conditions. They do not govern themselves. These conditions that assemble together have no intention to produce anything, and neither does their product have the intention to be produced. Again, there is a kind of chain, a causal nexus, one factor leading to another. Nothing has any independent status. Nothing has control over itself. That which is asserted as primal substance and that which is imputed as a self, since they have unproduced, do not arise after having purposely thought, I shall arise in order to cause harm. In verse 27 we find a refutation of certain views held by non-Buddhist schools of Shantideva's time, particularly the views of the two principal schools, Samakaya school. The idea that is being presented here is that no things and events arise out of their own choice, and none enjoys an independent status. Here's a meditation with visualization. Imagine a scenario where someone that you know has a temper in a very acrimonious relationship or a situation where something is happening. He shows all signs of an intense state of anger, loses all mental composure, creates very negative vibes, goes to the extent of harming himself or herself and breaking things. Then reflect upon the immediate effects of intense anger or hatred. The reason why I think we should visualize this happening to others is because it is easier to see the faults of others and to see our own faults. Verse 37, Shantideva states that if it is possible for individuals to injure themselves or cause harm to themselves out of ignorance or carelessness, then it is also possible that they would inflict harm on others in the same manner. If they are prepared to inflict harm on themselves, it is very possible that they would inflict harm on others as well. In the next verse, Shantideva presents ways in which we can prevent the causes that would normally give rise to anger within us. He states that if inflicting harm upon others is in some sense an inalienable part of the nature of a person, then there is no point in holding against him or her. After all, that person cannot help it. Harming others is that person's essential nature. On the other hand, if it is not his or her essential nature, but rather some sort of circumstantial phenomenon, then when that person is at a fit of anger, he or she is under the influence of a circumstantial condition for which there is no point in holding him or her accountable. In the former case, it is analogous to begrudging fire because it burns. The ability to burn is part of the essential nature of fire. So to begrudge fire for possessing that nature is quite pointless. In the later case, if one holds a grudge against sentient beings who are under the influence of a circumstantial condition, then it's quite similar to someone who begrudges clouds that overcast the sky. It is not the essential nature of the sky to be overcast, but through circumstantial conditions, sometimes the sky is obscured by clouds. You know someone speaking badly of you behind your back and you react to the negativity with a feeling of hurt or anger, then you yourself destroy your own peace of mind. One's pain is one's own creation. There's a Tibetan expression that one should treat such things as if they were wind behind one's ear. In other words, just brush it aside. If one would do that, one would protect oneself from that feeling of hurt and agony. This shows that to a large extent, whether or not one suffers pain depends on how one responds to a given situation. What makes a difference is whether or not one is too sensitive and takes things too seriously. In our daily lives, we are sometimes too sensitive towards minor things. At the same time, toward other major problems that can create long-term consequences, we are not so sensitive. Verse 47, having been instigated by my own actions, those who cause me harm come into being. If by these actions they should fall into hell, surely isn't it I who am destroying them. Shantideva points out that it is our negative karma and deeds committed in the past that have caused the other person to inflict that injury or harm on us. In addition, because of the negative act, the person creates negative karma. So in a sense, we are causing the downfall of the other person because we are, through our karma, forcing the other person, the perpetrator of the crime or the aggressor, to create negative karma. 55. Because it will hinder my worldly gain, even if I do not want this, I shall have to leave my worldly gains behind, and my evil alone will remain unmoved. In this verse, Shantideva anticipates another defense, the argument that we might be justified in retaliating against someone insulting us, speaking badly of us, or belittling us because these activities will hinder our worldly gains, successes, and achievements. If we don't retaliate against such acts, then they will obstruct our worldly achievements. Shantideva says that this is not adequate ground upon which to retaliate against others' insults or belittling acts. After all, even if such acts of others do hinder our worldly gains are ultimately left behind. They are of benefit and use only in this lifetime. But when one dies, one has to leave them behind, so they are not of that much importance. By responding negatively to others' insults or belittling acts, for instance, if one loses one temper and acts in a negative way, then the negative karma, which has been created by these acts, is something that one has to carry along with one even into future lives. Thus, it is better that I die today than live a long but wicked life. For even if people like me should live a long time, there will always be the suffering of death. Suppose someone should awaken from a dream in which he experienced 100 years of happiness, and suppose another should awaken from a dream in which he just experienced one moment of happiness.